Hello everyone, today we introduce very briefly the Bishops' Wars and the beginning of the English Civil War for our early modern warfare series. I decided to upload more frequently about the latter. I think it's important for Schwerpunkt to see that you are receptive. Today we really just discuss things in very simple outline. Then at some point we will of course continue with other videos, but also make battle episodes. That is somewhat the content that we lack the most for early modern warfare. I actually already made the Congress number of videos about the armies of the English Civil War. We have not really covered like everything, but we talk about infantry with its organization, military dress, and more. So we will continue that to at a point. And then there is a pretty hefty at this point modern warfare playlist of which I'm really proud. We don't talk much manualistic modern history, for which today we will talk very briefly also about the general context, which is also in fact like a prelude to the actual war, and so the sort of more strictly military analysis that I want to make of the series of wars. As you know, there is for example, the wars of the three kingdoms, that they all overlap right with one another. There are strifes between, say, Scotland and Ireland, and civil wars within the same. And of course, even after the end of the English Civil War, there is all a legacy of conflict that reaches up to the age of Marlborough, and think about the Jacobites and more. There is really a lot to cover. I actually do have some background about this topic. I took classes on 17th century Britain and Ireland, and I sort of developed it more into the military side of the story, like, I don't know, Montrose, Bonnie Dundee, like this kind of figure, the Battle of Bamberg. We'll talk about them all, because again, gradually there is really a lot to cover, right? The Battle of the Boyne, I don't know, you name them, Drogheda, even just, there is a tyrannical side of me that, even from a Catholic background, makes me, say, at least admire Cromwell in many ways. And I do know that for a largely Anglo-American audience, of course, some positions that I already expressed, for example, like liking very much John of England as a ruler and not considering him incapable at all, right? Or considering Charles I in this case as the most capable of the Stuarts, actually. May sound in fact like odd, but I have my motivations for this, and so I think it's interesting, if anything, in part, as many of you have asked me to talk more a bit, like this side at least gave me hints about, like, of course, more English, more American warfare. Like, we will, right? I have planned here, I can tell you in advance, a series about the American Civil War, right? And we will start getting, pretty much in thorough depth into that as well. So it's the chance to see at least what a European thinks about these things. Of course, Britain to me counts very much as Europe, but of course there is also like a divide of some sort, culturally speaking, that sort of aligns also with other countries that sort of stemmed from English expansionism. So it's all more interesting for this reason. So it's impossible not to start a series on the English Civil War, that is actually a series of wars, by discussing a bit the very concept of the imposition of any restriction on royal powers in England. Right? This was very much ingrained in the English parliamentary tradition. England had somehow remained, up to this point in history, sort of not really isolated. We talk about maritime history, that's another story from the late Tudor era. I have to go on with the series about the Armada, by the way. But when you look at properly, like compared with the continental military developments, surely like Britain had remained importantly backwards. And the reason being, in many ways, the historical limitations that had existed on the monarchic action since the English Middle Ages, and in this time, that especially after the involvement in the continent, at least in a direct, sort of hegemonic sense, that was just something that the English had managed to do at the latest during the 100 Years of War, had brought like a block right in the development, in fact, of an updated military. It's not before, in fact, Cromwell's new model army that England really gaps that divide with the continent, and more because the Parliament at that point sort of took off, as you know, and also in terms of expenses, what Charles I was exacting with the ship money would be just like a very meager amount of the one for which the British Army began to take off, to rise. Importantly, I recently made a video about the differences between the French, the Dutch, and the British firepower doctrine, if we can so say, and we've seen how even there, like the Dutch were at the end of the 17th century, were the most directly pressed by French expansionism, and the English were essentially recovering at that point their role of significant power in the continent, as well, participating in the alliances against France on the continent, and beginning to update also in this ultimate stage, like in the development towards linear tactics. Utterly repugnant would have been the very concept of imposing any restrictions on royal powers, however, on the Stuart monarchs, right, of the first half of the 17th century, Charles I and his father, King James I. So, in alignment with other monarchs across Europe, both sovereigns held the belief that they ruled by divine right. Right? This was actually a very old and sort of traditional concept that fundamentally crashed against the very deeply ingrained liberties of the English Parliament. The Stuart monarchs considered themselves chosen by and accountable only to God. Charles I referred to especially at the sovereign power as the one of little gods on earth, which was also yet another traditional concept, right, of divine election, of actual individual accomplishment, and as you know, like the Catholic sympathies would not properly decrypt the Catholic fate of these Anglican monarchs was very much in favor, of course, like of the importance of the works, of the achievements, of the actual relevance of power wielding as a matter of merit, and so, say, reflecting in the royal condition the divine blessing in that, right? There is also a very intense international context. Here, England, as you know, has been backing historically the Dutch revolt against Spain for, of course, different reasons, one of which was definitely not less important than the others. That is, of course, the confessional support that England, in fact, gave to the Protestants in Europe. You can argue, we've seen it also in the recent video about the French Wars of Religion, that in fact had England being knocked out by the Armada, that probably Protestantism would have ended in Europe, right? It would have been essentially obliterated, because England was the only major power that could fundamentally support also these minor ones. The United Provinces would eventually secede from the Holy Roman Empire. Then there were lots of German Protestant states, but they were sort of scattered in many ways. The Scandinavian monarchies were sort of not as equally relevant or powerful in like making leverage in this major wrestling taking place in Europe, as we've seen the same Huguenots in France and so on. There was also like an old rivalry with France, though, and in this, the mostly in a matter of continental hegemony, that still the English saw as sort of viable. And from the other side, the especially maritime global competition with Spain, that at different times, however, align in fact with the aforementioned hostility towards France, and that was especially pursued by the Stuarts. In England, there were specific factions, like the pro-Spanish one, essentially being the pro-Catholic, pro-monarchic one, by some extent. And lots of things are actually going on. The 80 Years' War, the 30 Years' one. So the very ideas, the very beliefs that brought, let's say, the English Civil War to break out were fueled by the confessional as well as also the strictly military, say, veteran experience of those who had fought on the continent, including many British, Irish mercenaries. We'll talk more about them in another video. I made a video about the Scottish Lowland pikemen, talking about partly their service in, for example, in Sweden, in the Swedish army. And one cannot really ignore these aspects. When one realizes, for example, how many Englishmen participated to the Dutch revolt, but also how much rivalry existed between the rising United Provinces and the same England. There would be, as you know, many properly maritime wars between these two powers. I would like to expand into those a bit, like the expansion of the Royal Navy historically, especially later. These are all pivotal topics in early, say, well, in modern warfare in general. But going back to the Stuarts, these asserted that their subjects, and here we're talking, of course, of the English, but also the Scottish and the Irish ones, whether within the London Parliament or beyond, had really no influence following this divine delegation over royal policy. And there were many reasons why they would actually act like this. In many ways, a sovereign could not simply be right and pretend that the parliament also would innocently remain at its place, right? It was absolutely obvious that the king and the parliament, from their respective sides, would try to increase, to augment their power at the detriment of one another. It's rather the paths that this followed that at some point got so much, say, steep in terms of the direction, one side or another, that brought to the inevitability, the will, to war between the two sides. What neither party acknowledged was that English kings had never held such an almighty position. Of course, the Scottish background of the Stuarts, and so especially with James I, really the introduction to a new world that had belonged to the Tudors, against which, generally speaking, the Scots had competed. As you know, James' mother had been beheaded by the same Elizabeth I, and there was a legacy of resentment towards the Tudor Protestant legacy that support, in fact, a system that was not sort of the most conservatively royalist in nature. The problem, of course, is that England had to grow, had to develop, had to withstand the pressure that the foreign competitors really put on her. The economy depended on that. The parliament, in line of principle, was not against war, but would see these expenses as a good tool, like to play with when the king asked him for it, to get more power, more liberty. And so it's within this context of political and institutional development that such wrestling would occur. A way to appreciate the Stuart monarchs in England is to realize that essentially the Tudors had lived off the rent provided by the confiscation of monasteries under Henry VIII. There had been, yes, a maritime expansion, especially under Elizabeth, but this had not yet been enough to make England a great power, simply because the general aims of these monarchs was to conservatively, in fact, remain, to use those means that, in fact, would concern the same Stuarts at a point to summon the Parliament to get the funds necessary for a bigger policy. And the Parliament really wanted something in exchange. James I arrives in this country, testing immediately the difficulties that the Parliament presented. It's really Charles I that, as the best of the Stuarts, really reorganizes the country, importantly from a fiscal, administrative point of view, trying, of course, to avoid the reliance on the Parliament, but that, of course, could have not really been possible. The Parliament was the expression of the southeast, the more developed part of the country, and, of course, of different visions of politics, of culture. But essentially, the Stuarts took the next step. They dealt with the Parliament in order to push England to a higher level in the international policy and not making the country be dependent, just say, on the Spanish. From the other side, you have the Parliament's rights to participate in government, of course, having been long enshrined in the English tradition. James, the first monarch of the Scots House of Stuart to reign in England, descended to the throne in 1603, just after the death of Elizabeth I. Throughout its authority to vote on taxes, the Parliament immediately taught James this painful and humiliating lessons when he attempted to flout tradition with such unacceptable actions as, for example, relying on personal favorites for political advice and treating foreign policy as a purely royal prerogative. And the path here was being outlined. James especially was very extravagant in expenses, and for this reason often more out of money than he would have been even when he actually got parliamentary funds. The general sense that the Stuarts were flirting with Spain was also seen as a sort of damage to especially the interests of those estates that were more involved in this more autonomous commercial maritime expansion. Of course, it's not like the Stuarts wanted to hamper that, but that still went to favor of the parliamentarian cause, making the king ever more strange to such business. Charles, who succeeded his father in 1625, proved to be even more obstinate in his belief in the divine right of kings and in personal royal rule. This was serving exactly that purpose of essentially reforming the country, trying to keep the Parliament aside as much as possible. The ship money, as you know, was levied, which was actually an important part of the provisions required to protect the coastal communities, especially in times of piracy like this one, that of course was mostly used also in this royal self-aggrandizing policy over the Parliament. Consequently, the unyielding royal position soon collided with the irresistible force of Parliament. within just a year of Charles' accession, it can be argued that England was already being propelled towards what would have been, in fact, the civil war, step by step. Parliament struck the first blow against Charles' favourite, the Duke of Buckingham, with an act of impeachment for treason in 1626. Charles retaliated by threatening Parliament with royal vengeance, and the Parliament stood defiant. Outraged, Charles dissolved the Parliament in June 1626. Charles managed to score some important results, and he, of course, promoted his Royalist and Episcopalist views. As we'll see now, problems would arise also in Scotland, and so that the Protestant reaction to Charles' attempt of regulating such ecclesiastical communities was creating malcontent and chances for actual war. Eventually, as Charles found himself short of funds, which was the perennial issue because things happen and you do need money, he was compelled to reconvene Parliament. 1628-29. He was actually granted the money he requested, but only after the strong Puritan faction in the Parliament had condemned the popery of the royal court, which was an enormous insult. Charles was furious, and on this occasion he dismissed again Parliament, proceeding to actually rule without it. Right? This was the course of royal policy until 1640. Right? So for essentially more than 10 years, the Parliament was not convened, and the sovereign had, of course, to adapt to different ways, in fact, to levy money, which essentially is also the phase in which he enacted all these. Mostly he revived some old customs that, albeit lawful and borderline, so telling the truth, were, however, politically controversial, and of course going to the detriment of parliamentary representation, which angered bitterly the parliament members that knew that sooner or later, of course, the monarchy would have required them to provide it with further funds. As a response to the religious insult, Charles also appointed 2 high church favorites to oversee the regulation of the Protestant Church of England, which also in Scotland created issues. In 1640, in fact, after 11 years of personal rule, Charles was compelled to convene the Parliament under the most unfavorable circumstances, because the Puritans within the Scots Church were vigorously resisting Charles' religious reforms, forcing the king to consider the option of war in order to impose his will. However, war necessitated enough funding, and the latter required the Parliament. These were big expenses. They had to go at war with Scotland fundamentally. So that when the Parliament was convened in the spring of 1640, it refused to cooperate and transformed itself into a platform for further Puritan attacks against Charles, that, as we've seen, had been an object of major content in the general, say, religious undertone of this clash. Unsurprisingly, no financial support was provided either, and within less than a week, for this reason, Charles dissolved the so-called Short Parliament. So the so-called Bishops' War, there had been a couple actually, but here we make it simpler, we're the new emergency here, because the Scots invaded England, right? There was initially Charles went at war directly, but the effort, as we've seen, without parliamentary funds was limited, and the Scots essentially managed to occupy some strongholds, such as Durham, for example. And despite all the, the great commitment to the cause, the Earl of Strafford, that had been accumulating forces, by the way, in Ireland, was unable to provide an effective military defense of northern England. Charles ultimately had no choice but to agree to an armistice at that point with essentially embarrassing terms. He allowed essentially the Scots to occupy northern England with the territory from Berwick to York under their control. And cherry on top, which was even more damaging, of course, for the monarchic position, England was required to pay the Scots £860 per day until a peace treaty was signed. Now, this is the culmination, as you understand, of a very specifically gambling policy. Right? Charles had wanted to do without the Parliament. War had broken out, and he had tried to cope with it, but he had lost badly because of the lack of means, and the royal reputation now was in tatters. I mean, it was specifically the monarchy as such, and in front of the Parliament, that was also, of course, like being damaged by the war at large, seen as an hindrance or something that had to be put back, together with the opportunity of resizing significantly its power. The unyielding Puritans recognized the moment to be ideal to retaliate against the king. In a sweeping act of vengeance, by the way, Charles was deprived of his closest advisors through legal means. Basically, he had to stand down while these people were put under trial. One of them was famously the same Earl of Strafford that was accused of high treason, having essentially communicated to Charles that the English army in Ireland was ready essentially to take over England, had he wanted, that these forces were at his disposal. The Earl was beheaded in May 1641. The other was the Archbishop William Laud, that was imprisoned in the Tower of London in December 1640 and executed 4 years later. Laud was seen as the symbol of the essentially Anglican abuse of power that had been exercised, also triggering the Bishops' War, and that's the reason why he would follow the same fate of his king. Charles was now at the mercy of the Parliament in many ways, which proved to be relentless, by the way. The king was compelled to agree to bills that abolished special royal courts, such as the historical Star Chamber. In fact, these parliamentary bills aimed to dismantle the very absolute monarchy that Charles represented. When we say absolute, bear in mind that, especially in this context, that the monarchy wasn't absolute at all, right? And nor it was actually close to become that. But there is, of course, a despotic, assertive policy that had been considered as tyrannic and beyond, like the powers that historically in England had been balanced by constitution. John Pym, member of the Parliament, Puritan, had essentially been responsible for the fall of the Duke of Buckingham out of royal grace. Earlier on, had also backed the Bill of Rights in 1628 to reduce the royal prerogatives in levying such contributions. and his fellow extremists in the parliament swiftly moved to introduce a militia bill now that granted the parliament control over all army appointments, which was not just a merely political move, at least symbolically speaking, just to counter some civil, like administrative policy of the king. This was about literally getting control on the English forces that were, as we'll see now, modest. After all, there wasn't really an army. There were the trained bands. They were sort of the only permanent thing in existence, but they were essentially militia. In fact, that's also why the bill was called like that. Meanwhile, Charles was diligently trying to win over Edward Hyde and other moderates that, would have accepted some sort of more Anglican royal settlement under some, conditions, of course. Charles also took measures to impeach the same Pym, John Hampden, who had been imprisoned because he hadn't wanted to pay the ship money, and 3 other Puritan anti-royalists. On January the 4th, 1642, Charles went to Westminster, famously enough accompanied by an armed guard, prepared to personally arrest the 5 men. It was really personal, but also national in political scale. However, having been forewarned of his intentions, the 5 all fled in an atmosphere that, as you know, was pretty tense and just bringing war essentially about. By this time, it was evident, in fact, that the only way to resolve the conflict between the king and the parliament was military action. The lines of battle for the impending conflict were already being drawn. This was really a point of non-return. Charles, who had been once so unpopular that he lacked organized support, was now backed, however, by those devotees of the Anglican Church, by those opposing further reforms aimed at bringing the king under Puritan control, by ordinary peasants with natural royalist sympathies, and by many others who felt alienated by the objective fanaticism of John Pym and his allies. This aspect is interesting because, as we will see now also from the geographical distribution of such forces, of course Charles was being backed by communities that were, in historical perspective, sort of countering the England that we have come to, say, appreciate the most, at least in its rampant success, especially starting like from the later 17th century and even more like from a century afterwards, that had really set his premises at this point in history. But there is also in this like a truly Anglo-Saxon principle, like as much as the parliament was the expression of representation of the country's estate and the and even more at this point in history, the most dynamic, propositive, confident, also aggressive, as we've seen, element in England. There was from one side like a level of conservatism that, as we've seen, struck also like just maybe the average person, to some extent, those people who thought, for example, that the growth of London had historically been against their own individual control, like the king, as we'll see now, will have greater support in northern England, for example. And when you look back at the historical sort of dimensions, I'm a bit medievally biased here, but obviously like the Saxon South was always sort of more countered by the Midlands, by a sort of an older England to some extent that would survive in that more Catholic element and nostalgia. On the other hand, you find really the Puritanic element in the Parliament scaring lots of people legitimately because of the radicalism and the extremism of their positions. Of course, This context, as we've seen, was pretty heated. It was a great, say, concern, at least what was really at stake: political violence and sense of, again, of stained honor. Like, remember also the religious element is very important here, because we are still in the age of confessional clashes fully. England was also a bit more separated in this sense from the continental bypassing of the same towards the end of the 30 Years' War, towards something, say, more, you would call post-Westphalian. Westphalia had yet to happen, but say a bit more Machiavellian in this regard. You know that at this point in history, we've seen it also in the video about the French Wars of Religion, was a lot. This would boom with, of course, with the beheading of Charles I. In the end, like a, monarchicide of like legitimacy, political theories that were aiming at unhinging a bit what had been the traditional sense of sacred royalty. This was especially evident from the Protestant side of the story, especially now that essentially the United Provinces had won their war against Spain. Essentially, the 30 Years' War had witnessed the failure of the Habsburgic attempt to unify Germany, and England now, in fact, was coming to properly behead their king, right? So it's a very difficult time. It's an incredibly powerful time for everybody involved. And ultimately, the Royalist side consisted of 1/3 of the Parliamentary House of Commons and the majority of the House of Lords, which also tells you how sort of divided politically and institutionally the country was. The House of the Lords, of course, included some of England's wealthiest men, which in turn did represent, of course, that privilege that sort of the majority, at least of the England, in the southeast of the country, that sort of was producing more, was doing more in a greater sense, was contesting in and hoping actually to take the place of in many ways. So we'll have time, of course, if you want, in other videos to analyze better these times. But let's talk also a bit about the military background, like the beginning of the war. Right. Let's start from the geography of it that we have already hinted at. Charles' support originated essentially from the north of England, but also the west of the country that, as you know, historically had been less developed. The Parliament maintained instead the control over the south, East Anglia, including London, of course, and the south coast ports. So having a very important advantage logistically, monetarily, materially. Also for other reasons. There were depots, stocks in the rest of the country and that really sided on either side, depending on, say, very contingental reasons. Essentially, every community at some point posed themselves the question of, with whom do we side at this point that war is breaking out. The aristocracy remained firmly royalist, of course, like this was their general deal and prerogative, so they would have not simply let it go. The gentry, instead, the tier in the hierarchy below them, was sadly divided. As often occurs in civil wars, relatives of all kinds found themselves on opposing sides. There was this Puritan push, again, that sort of represented a bit that sort of more innovative, also science, practical based. It was all a level of empiricism already developing from quite a while in England. That seemed, in fact, in our perspective at least, the more, say, the future, right? At the time, it wasn't at all like that. Most people were conservative, and they understood the reasons of the more radical fringes that had the guts, by the way, to stand against the sovereign for issues that, in fact, involved them as well. But they didn't think that probably like destroying the monarchy was necessarily the best way to go. And the ideology that divided the leaders was of lesser importance than the rank and file, of course, as a consequence as well. Apart from the trained bands, as we said, there was no real standing army, and troops were assembled only for the duration of specific conflicts. The London trained bands were obviously the most important. London was already for quite a while, historically, by far the most important city in England. But again, it wouldn't be these forces actually that to make the difference. It's like the creation of a full, say, permanent professional army under Cromwell that really changes the game. At times, the average troops during this war were recruited voluntarily, while at other times they were obtained through impressment, which was just like common right throughout the period. And later on I made a video about the press gangs, also in later like 18th century Britain, as far as the navy, the army was concerned. Once a war concluded, the armies were disbanded. This was the most obvious course, given the, as we've seen, the scarce resources that the government could leverage in the first place, in a time which, in fact, like a solid statal foundation had not properly been given. Like, what is important of this period is how, in a sense, how archaic England still was by this point. It was a feudal country in many ways, and this brought with itself its limits. That's why we see also in perspective like what Charles was doing, sort of, more doomed to fail as it did. It's not to say, however, that England could have not achieved, an important, probably not like the status that we know of, like in the last couple of centuries, but still an effectively conservative one. This system provided, as you understand, ordinary soldiers with little incentive to understand what they were fighting for. And they also exhibited a reasonable animosity towards engaging in battles far from their homes. These conditions had been, in fact, usually like the reason why the same English army had not reformed at this point, had not really even felt the need to just organize itself on a more modern pattern, just also by the side of the Parliament. Again, the Navy was already another thing, but a great deal of why the Armada deal had been such, in fact, a successful one for England is that had it been for the fleet, of course, England didn't have means to withstand the full might of a permanent professional army, say like the Spanish one. Like, the country would have been subdued. And this is, in many ways, of course, a major strategic constant, given the geography of the country. There would be invasions, like the one of William of Orange can be seen as one, even though it was just like a dynastic substitution. But it's true that since William the Conqueror, nobody effectively managed to invade and conquer England. And this did influence, of course, her land forces. This war was to change a lot, right? Because it was seen, of course, that this shortcoming was damaging the future of the country, that there was a Celtic fringe that was still fundamentally acting as if they were two different kingdoms from England. It's, of course, traditionally this had been the norm. But we know how English imperialism started to work, and that was something deeply ingrained and innate, and actually very positive and successful in Anglo-Saxon culture. We documented it since the Middle Ages, but these were not the Middle Ages anymore. In these circumstances, by the way, the likelihood of mutiny, desertion, or wars was ever present. Dwindling, understrength, shrinking inside of the units was like a plague of the era. This is not just about England, of course. Most troops on campaign would die of illness, of deprivations, rather than actual massacre. And this didn't help anyway. This was particularly true for the impressed men. Logically, were often the idle and dissolute remnants of society, known for their wild behavior. Made multiple videos explaining how, like, there was all dynamic of social alienation actually accelerating at this point in history, that in part had even gone in parallel with the new sort of Protestant insight on how, like, this metaphysical relation to the essentially insignificance of works like the fantassin had actually to behave like as if his humanity had not meant anything. And of course, some of these individuals, most of these individuals, were truly the scum of the earth, right? They were social, dump. They were, outcasts, criminals, etc. And of course, the war wouldn't make them any better. In this sense, it was a shocking level of incredible brutality. By the way, it should be considered here that England, during the Civil War, reached its highest historical level up then of mobilization, probably mass mobilization. There were hundreds of thousands of Englishmen in arms throughout this period. So this was also very transformative for the country as a whole. In any case, both sides during the Civil War found it challenging to raise suitable forces, and the issue became most acute concerning officer material. Most officers had gained their experience from fighting as mercenaries in the 30 Years' War in Europe, which was still going on, but most of it had been already fought. Some mercenaries would actually fight from abroad, like this was a thing, like the English had historically, we've seen it in the Tudor armies, imported not just mercenaries, mostly from Germany, but I don't know, like Flemish guns and horses, for example. It was all a technical dimension that made England a bit more rustic in this sense. England would become, however, also a battlefield on its own, and we will see now why when talking about the various arms, because as I already explained in the videos about the English infantry, especially of the Civil War, with all those woods and hedges of the English countryside, actually the pike would decrease in importance much more quickly than it had actually been even the case for the 30 Years' War. In fact, I made multiple videos also explaining a bit the entire idea that the Dutch, the Swedes, the English were bringing forward like a more effective type of tactics or war compared to their Catholic counterparts. This is really not true, but there are some indicators that gave that impression. And during the English Civil War, especially the fact that the shot had become quickly prevalent in many circumstances, so helping in that process of just like transformation into linear tactics that, however, in this sense had nothing yet during this period, say, teleological in the dynamic, meaning that this is just how they ended up fighting, but it wasn't because they had sort of a better army that had reached that level of order, vision, or doctrine, to be, say, a bit anachronistic in terminology. But it helped understanding certain dynamics and spreading some habits that some of these forces would have also, in fact, brought abroad to an extent. And the English Civil War was really a big deal, by the way, internationally. We will see it during the series. Now, upon their return to England at the onset of the Civil War, those men who had fought on the continent that definitely had a much more advanced warfare historically than an English one, at least until Cromwell, in fact brought with them the very knowledge acquired from such a variety of European armies, German, French, Dutch, Danish, Swedish, etc., which would build up that necessity, that understanding in the establishment of a more effective military system for winning the war, right? And making order around in Britain and Ireland. Despite the widely recognized superiority of the new Swedish style of warfare that among the entire Protestant say side had truly been the most objectively, like positively effective in measure, without too much exaggeration and or sensationalism. The Imperials had maintained during that war still very high standards. The Swedish had opened like to another phase in its history of warfare and procured some dynamics, especially the coming back of cavalry and the increase in firepower for formations that, however, were heavily subsidized and or had gained important progressed military experience. So I had such a great commander like Gustavus Adolphus. We talked about the Swedish army, so I explained at different levels what we're looking at, right? But there are some, as you know, innovations attributed to Gustavus Adolphus that wouldn't kick in the Swedish army until the time of Charles XII, and that are, in fact, traditionally attributed, but not really there. So that there's a bit of mythology, and the Protestant propaganda at the time was incredibly effective in living still into, say, today's world, in the historiographical perception of the sense of advancement was, however, more or less going in parallel with one of the opponents. In fact, the English Civil War was a context in which a great deal of debate arose regarding the selection of battle tactics. There were some very nostalgic Englishmen who, including within the London trained bands, who thought that they could have successfully reintegrated the longbow on a large scale of warfare, while, as we've seen in multiple videos, also about the survival, in fact, of weapons like this in Renaissance warfare, in fact, had become obsolete by the mid-16th century. The early Tudor army made good, effective use of the longbow, but at this time, in fact, when the war broke out, there was nothing to do. Interestingly enough, this the double-armed man, this was the project, was presented to the St. Charles I by saying, like, look at it's also in this sort of English sense of pride, etc., and of tradition, say that tactics would have still been effective. And this was highlighting also a bit the degree with which, let's say, the modern thought was actually increasing a level of speculation that was not to meet the expectancy. Furthermore, the looming prospect of civil war in England attracted further, as we've seen, foreign soldiers who ranged from greedy opportunists to unscrupulous rogues, many of whom had little interest in the cause for which they offered their swords as well. The armies that initiated the English Civil War were significantly deficient in many ways. As we said, like, the English army at this point was pretty poor thing, truly, like in the development of the art of war. It was, again, a standard militia of a Western country, now sided, at least for the war, by this more professional element of mercenaries. It was not very different from what you've seen in Germany, etc., but also the broader scale of the engagement, the political fragmentation of the country, the lack of pre-existing forces other than the ones that essentially were managed by this very united country. Like, think about Germany having all different states that could, in most cases, wouldn't actually be, in fact, any better than the English one at all, but let's say at least having different structures for levying armies on their own, like a broader theater with greater land continuity from which many countries would actually intervene in Germany as well. Here was not really present. And so it all contributed to a relatively more compact, narrow, and sort of isolated experiment box. In addition to such numerous shortcomings, the English faced challenges such as inadequate supplies, irregular pay, and poor organization. This was notoriously true for the Royalists in particular. Were fighting essentially a bit more like an older, feudal army compared to the parliamentarians that had, again, like sort of the best of London, of its, say, modernity, of its resources. Actually, the shortcomings were present from both sides, dramatically so, but I mean, the Royalists in some cases would literally mobilize clubsmen, right, among their forces, and there was, as we've seen, a level of primitivity, right, in tactical means and more, that is really striking. We will see this better along the way. In any case, England ran out of resources. The country exhausted itself, so nobody was really swimming in, supplies and resources in general. For King Charles, who raised his battle standard at Nottingham on August the 22nd, 1642, the Civil War had a quite tumultuous start. On one side, the Royalists' failure the previous spring to break the parliamentary hold on the munitions stores at Hull meant that Charles' forces were already lacking armaments before the first battle had even begun. Hull had a massive armament storage, and the local authorities refused to open the gates to the king. On the other side, early in August, Charles received a much-needed boost of audacity and expertise when his nephews, Prince Rupert and Prince Maurice, successfully evaded the naval blockade in the English Channel, which was controlled by the Parliament, of course, and brought trained men and munitions from Holland. These men were noblemen of the empire. They had really been raised into, like, also the Legion of the 30 Years of War as they were kids. Prince Rupert of the Rhine, at the age of 22, was, as a consequence, one of the most notable dashing blades in English history. This was really the time of incredibly flamboyant and, bold, audacious behavior. This is the same time of, the Three Musketeers epopee, and these were the kind of men who took the battlefield literally with this enormous contempt towards, by the way, their immense privilege and prestige, and would literally get themselves killed for this cause that they saw, of course, in a primarily traditional sense. Never forget about this aspect, not just from the Royalist side. Prince Rupert was deemed to be militarily brilliant, yet somewhat impulsive. We will see him at work, let's say, during the series. However, what proved even more beneficial to his uncle Charles were Rupert's, in fact, less spectacular virtues, nevertheless very important ones, particularly his talent for organization, which established a military infrastructure in the Royalist counties that later fell under his command. Some of Rupert's innovative contributions, including reports from military governors on the status of their garrisons, for example, regular communication between royal headquarters and royal communities within the counties, as well as the construction of robust defensive fortifications for key locations such as Worcester, that would only be taken by the parliamentarians later in the war. Consider that at this point in history, no country had yet developed a truly centralized control of, for example, supplies and armament, and like a direct administration capable of properly allocating the right amount of such resources for the military as it was being recruited, trained, and prepared for campaign. This is what just the French army of Louis XIV in a few decades would be able to accomplish. England was very far from this, and so already having something like the strong man, like managing to coordinate, to command all these various English centers with individually, like, with poor resources, but still in fact very important ones when grouped together. Having with this capacity of putting things together was incredibly important strategically and logistically during the war. It was, however, Prince Rupert, the military talent, some people say genius, who made the first significant impact in the Civil War when the initial clash of arms occurred at Powick Bridge near Worcester on September 23rd, 1642. Here, Rupert, commanding approximately 1,000 men, launched a surprise attack and routed a parliamentary force of roughly equal size. It was an important opening. 1,000 men was just relatively few in the bigger picture, but the war, was yet to escalate fully, and this was a first shot that, favored the Royalists. Typically, Rupert did not allow his cavalry any time to put on their armor before ordering them to charge at the parliamentary Roundheads, as they were deploying in an adjacent field. This is quite interesting because there was almost a knightly chivalric understanding of how, this is how literally medieval knights would fight, right? They wouldn't mount their horses before time because they would have exhausted them. They would have not had their helms on before charge because they would have they needed to breathe more freely. So speaking of Powick Bridge, in the melee that followed, the Roundheads broke in disorder and fled, leaving behind a significant number of casualties, and taking with them a fearsome impression of the might of Rupert's cavalry. It was the one probably of an abelian world that eventually still had its bullets to shoot, or better, his steel to fix into someone, chopping heads and other pleasantries. And in fact, I think we didn't talk about, let me check what we talked about the English Civil War, because as I was saying at the beginning, it's still incomplete, right? But aside from the very important topic in itself, there is also a lot of evidence for the single arms, for the single weapons. Alright, I think I made only infantry. Yep, not so much actually. Yeah, but that will come as well. That is for the more regular Modern Warfare series that I started, say, historically on Schwerpunkt. But you understand how, in any case, the general picture here is the one of quite balanced clash at the beginning, right? At least there were some, say, major factors that wouldn't obviously help the Royalist cause, and we know how it ended, but at the time you don't have to give for granted that things would go exactly in that direction. Alright, so that's why it's interesting to look a bit at the wars more. Here we have English Civil War flags. Yes, English Civil War infantry composition, English Civil War dress, and English Civil War infantry, an introduction. Alright, good. We'll make more videos because this is really one of those topics that deserve it. I'm glad that I really already have some background, right, to offer you and to expand on for later videos. For today, however, I stop it here. I just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, do a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming content. As always, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.